Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you all fall asleep. So, before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. My name is Santiago. I am 40 years old, and I am a teacher. It was a gray afternoon, one of those when the rain hovered over the sky with an ominous heaviness, as if trying to warn of what was to come. The high school where I worked, located in the heart of a dangerous community, had a desolate air under that unrelenting downpour. The years had taught me to deal with difficult students, young people who, in many cases, came to my classes with hard life stories and pasts marked by pain. However, something in the atmosphere that day was different, as if the cold of the rain had seeped into the bones of the building, intensifying the tension that already existed in every corner of that school. That morning I had handed out final grades, and, as expected, some students did not receive the news of their failures well. One of them, Adrian, was a boy who had always been difficult for me to decipher. His grades were not the worst, but his effort in his work was nil, and his constant absences had left him with no chance of passing. I knew that his environment was dominated by violence, that he was part of a gang, but I never thought it would go beyond the boundaries of school. That afternoon, after the last bell, the building began to empty rapidly. The sound of the rain against the windows increased, filling the hallways with a monotonous echo that made the place seem even more desolate. I stayed in my classroom, finishing up some reports, when I heard footsteps outside the classroom. I thought it might be some students who had fallen behind, but the sound stopped just outside the door. I felt a strange uneasiness, as if something invisible and heavy had landed on my shoulders, but I decided not to make a big deal of it and continued working. A few minutes passed and I noticed that the uneasy feeling did not go away. It was then that I looked up at the window overlooking the hallway. In the reflection I could see the silhouette of someone standing in the doorway, motionless. A cold current ran through me. I took a deep breath and tried to concentrate, convincing myself that it was probably a misunderstanding. But immediately a dark foreboding warned me that something was wrong. The door opened with a dull creak. The figure I had seen in the reflection entered. I immediately recognized Adrian. His expression was a mixture of anger and resentment that I had never seen in someone so young. The rain was intensifying outside, the sound of the drops becoming deafening, as if it was trying to warn me or drown out the outside world, leaving him and me alone in that room. Without exchanging a word, I watched as his hands went to his jacket pockets, and something in his gaze told me that his intentions were far more dangerous than I imagined. The door closed behind him, and the classroom became a kind of trap in which we were both trapped. My heart began to beat with a violence that almost dazed me, and the air in the room became heavy, charged with a tension that only grew with every second. In that instant, I couldn't help but remember one of the meetings in which the director warned us about the risks of working in that school, about how we had to be careful, especially with those students who carried the violence of their environment like a second skin. Adrian pulled a metal object out of his pocket, and my eyes recognized it instantly. A knife, sharp and shiny, its edge reflecting the flickering lights of the classroom. I felt a shiver run through me from head to toe. I knew I couldn't panic, that any false move could trigger the worst. But at that moment, all I could do was step back, trying to get away from him, keeping a distance that would soon shrink to nothing. My mind was trying to process every detail of the situation. I knew Adrian was angry that I had failed, but I never imagined it could come to this, to confront me like that, armed and with a look that I could only describe as cold and implacable. The rain outside continued to pour hard, creating a kind of sound background that seemed to set the rhythm of my own panic. With each step I took, I felt the classroom getting tighter and tighter. I tried to look around for a possible exit, but the desk and chairs formed a maze that prevented me from moving quickly. Adrian was moving calmly, a calmness that only made my fear increase. I knew that there was no one in the hallways, that the other teachers had already left, and that the security cameras, if there were any in that area, did not capture what was happening inside that room. When I saw myself cornered against one of the walls, I knew I had no escape. I tried to reason silently with myself, to find some way out in my thoughts, but reality hit me hard. There was no escape. I saw how Adrian raised the knife, and at that moment, I felt a survival instinct that pushed me to react. I managed to narrowly dodge his first attack, and in that brief moment of distraction, I tried to run for the door, but the wet floor, impregnated by the moisture seeping through the windows, caused me to slip and fall. It was then that I felt a sharp stab in my arm. Adrian had managed to wound me. Blood began to gush out, and the pain made me realize the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just an annoying student. He wasn't just a warning. He was out to hurt me. The seconds became eternal as I tried to crawl, to get back on my feet. Outside, the storm was raging, as if the sky itself was participating in this scene of terror, intensifying the atmosphere of tension that surrounded me. I felt my strength draining away, but my instinct told me that I could not give up. I remembered my family, the years of work and dedication, and I forced myself to keep going, to fight to get out of that place alive. Finally, I managed to reach the door and crawled out of the classroom, the pain in my arm becoming unbearable. I heard no more footsteps behind me. Adrian did not follow me. Perhaps he thought he had done his job, or that no one would believe him if he accused him. I crawled until, with the last of my strength left, I reached the entrance of the building and saw a guard helping me out. No one saw Adrian leave. No one understood what really happened. The wound on my arm healed with time, but the memory of that afternoon never left me. I decided not to press charges against Adrian. I didn't know if it was out of fear or out of the belief that perhaps there was still hope for him. What is certain is that the incident left its mark on my relatives. My parents and my wife constantly urged me to stop teaching at that school, to consider my safety and that of our family. Yielding to their concern, I made the difficult decision to request a transfer to another school. Months passed and life seemed to resume its normal course. I changed jobs, settled in a safer environment, and began to rebuild my peace of mind. Unfortunately, one day I received news that left a bitter taste in my mouth. Adrian had been killed in a gang fight. The news hit me like a punch in the stomach, bringing back those dark and confusing memories. I wondered if, by not pressing charges, I had contributed to his end. If at some point I could have done something to prevent his fate. The image of his cold gaze, of his slow steps towards me with the knife in his hand, came back to my mind. Sometimes I wondered if on that occasion he was really so lost that he had no way back, or if it had been my only chance to show him that there was still another way out. But now it was too late. Adrian's life had been extinguished in the same world of violence that had always surrounded him, and the weight of that decision would remain a mystery in my conscience, an unpaid debt. My name is Miguel. I'm 52 years old, and I'm a policeman. That night, the storm covered the city with unusual intensity. The rain pounded the rooftops and the streets with a fury that seemed ready to wash the place clean of all life. From the patrol car, I watched the drops bounce off the windshield as I tried to stay awake in the dark routine of the night watch. I had been working as a policeman for several years now, and although I had seen many things, something about that night made me uneasy, a feeling that I could not decipher. It all started with an emergency call. At first, the noise of the rain almost covered the sound of the alert on the radio, but I focused when I heard a child's trembling voice on the other end of the line. What little I understood chilled my blood. A child calling for help, saying that his sister was hurt and that his father had beaten her. He said it in a whisper, almost afraid to be heard, as if the weight of each word was crushing him. There wasn't much to understand. In situations like that, every second counts. Without wasting time, I set off, my siren drowned out by the roar of the storm and the sound of thunder lost in the lightning. The direction of the call took me to a residential area on the outskirts of the city, a quiet area that until then seemed oblivious to such incidents. As I drove, I felt the tension building in me. that mixture of responsibility and fear that only a police officer can understand. I knew I was entering the unknown, and although protocol dictated waiting for backup, the urgency of that child's voice urged me not to stop. Every second was vital. When I arrived at the house, I could barely see it through the lightning reflections. It was a small 2-story house, located at the end of a dark street without much traffic. The lights at the entrance were off, and only a faint glow came from one of the second-floor windows. The wind was rustling the trees in the garden, and the rain was falling in curtains so thick that I could barely make out the details. I approached the door, my heart pounding and my mind alert, aware that at any moment something could happen. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I tried again, this time harder, and still I heard not a sound inside. It was as if the whole house was plunged into a sepulchral silence, an emptiness so deep that my breathing seemed to echo in the night. I decided to go in. The code allowed for action to be taken in risky situations, and it was clear that something terrible could be happening inside. The inside of the house was even darker than the outside. Barely illuminated by the flashes of lightning through the windows, the place seemed abandoned, devoid of life. There was a strange disorder in the living room, old furniture and an atmosphere charged with something indescribable, like a heavy, suffocating energy that prevented me from thinking clearly. As I moved through the house, my senses sharpened. Every little sound seemed to amplify in my head. I climbed the stairs slowly, alert for any movement. My footsteps crunched on the wooden steps, and though I tried to move noiselessly, each creak seemed like a scream in the midst of that overwhelming silence. I reached the second floor and noticed that the door to one of the rooms was ajar, barely held by the latch. My heart began to beat harder, as if I was preparing for a confrontation. I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside left me speechless. In the gloom, I made out a messy bed with wrinkled and stained sheets. To one side, there was a broken doll, lying on the floor, its eyes open in a vacant expression that seemed to stare at me. The atmosphere was heavy, and I immediately knew that something terrible had happened in that room. It was then that I saw the boy. He was hiding behind a piece of furniture, trembling with fear, his eyes swollen shut and his face covered with dried tears. He did not move, as if petrified, and his eyes were fixed on mine with a mixture of terror and despair. I felt a pang of pain at seeing him in that state. In my mind, I imagined the kind of horror that child had lived through, but I couldn't waste time. If his sister was hurt, every minute counted. As I approached the child, my eyes scanned the room for the sister. She was not there. I continued to search the hallway, opening doors, calling out to her in a desperate attempt to find her. I reached the end of the hallway and noticed one last closed door. When I tried to open it, it was locked, as if something on the other side was preventing me from getting in. I felt a shiver run through me. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. With a last effort, I pushed the door with all my strength, and it finally gave way, revealing the most disturbing scene I had ever seen. The young woman was lying on the floor, with visible wounds on her face and arms, her eyes half open and her breathing weak, as if she were in the last moments of consciousness. There was an expression of terror on her face, a mixture of pain and resignation that filled me with rage and helplessness. I knelt beside her, trying to talk to her, making sure she knew I was there to help her, but she could barely react. As I radioed for backup, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly and saw a man standing in the doorway, looking at me with an expression that would freeze anyone's blood. It was the father, the same man the boy had described in the call. His presence in the room was oppressive, as if he brought with him an unfathomable darkness. His eyes, charged with something I couldn't quite understand, stared at me, as if calculating his next moves. He didn't move, he didn't say a word, and during those seconds, a tense silence filled the room. I felt a mixture of fear and defiance. My mission was to protect those children, to get them out of that hell. But in the midst of that tension, a noise outside interrupted the moment. It was the siren of the reinforcements that were finally arriving. The man, hearing it, seemed to lose all his composure. With surprising speed, he escaped through a window, disappearing into the storm and leaving me alone with the children. When backup officers arrived, they secured the house and called for an ambulance. The young woman was transported to the hospital, and the boy was also treated, although his injuries were more invisible than physical. Hours later, the man was apprehended on the outskirts of the city. Apparently, he had been trying to flee in the rain, taking advantage of the darkness and confusion, but the police caught up with him before he could get too far away. They arrested him in a vacant lot, with a blank stare and a disjointed face, as if he was aware that his escape was nothing more than an illusion. He did not resist, not even when he was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police vehicle. When the report reached the station, his story turned out to be as heartbreaking as that of his children. This man, whose face bore the mark of despair and decay, was but a specter of himself. His life had been dragged down by alcoholism, the very poison that had corrupted him and transformed him into a being capable of inflicting so much pain on those he loved most. The young woman who had been cared for that night, her daughter, had lived in an environment of extreme poverty, neglect, and violence. Her mother had died years before, a victim of an illness that left her unable to provide the emotional and physical support her children needed. Since then, the man's home had become a place of constant suffering. The father, consumed by his addiction to alcohol, had not only neglected his children, but had robbed them of the opportunity for a better life. He had ceased to be a father and had become a monstrous figure, marked by his own inability to cope with life. Worst of all, even when his daughter tried to get away from his control, the man prevented the children from having contact with their maternal family. He had severed all ties with their grandmother, preventing the children from being cared for by the only figure who still loved them unconditionally. The little ones, who did not fully understand the magnitude of what they were living through, had been submerged in a destructive routine for 2 years, with no hope of escaping their environment. The child who had made the desperate call that night, looking for help, was the voice that had managed to break the silence of pain that had settled in that house. And it was thanks to that call that the truth finally came out. The children's maternal grandmother was immediately informed of the situation. She, an elderly woman living in a distant neighborhood, was contacted by social services so that she could take care of her grandchildren. She had long been struggling to see them, but the man, the father, had denied her the right to see them since the tragic day of his daughter's death, arguing that he could not trust her to care for them. When the grandmother arrived at the police station to receive her grandchildren, her eyes showed a mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and a deep sadness at the realization of what her grandchildren had endured. She was devastated by the suffering they had gone through, but she also felt that, at last, they could find a glimmer of peace. She hugged them tightly, promising them that from now on they would be safe, away from the hell they had lived through under their own father's roof. The children were placed in her custody, and from that day on, they began a new stage in their lives. Although the road to recovery would not be easy, at least now they were surrounded by love, far from the violence and darkness that had defined their childhood. Grandma took them to her home, a simple but loving place where peace reigned in every corner. She could not give them back the lost time, but she could offer them what their father never gave them: stability, unconditional love, and the opportunity to heal. The man, in turn, was taken to prison, where he faced charges of child abuse, neglect, and other offenses related to the mistreatment of his children. His sentence was severe, although many thought his greatest punishment had already come. His own life had been destroyed by his addiction and his decisions. The shadow of her figure would never cease to haunt the children, but at least, at last, they could begin to build a future away from her influence. That night's storm, both literally and figuratively, had left behind a trail of suffering, but it also opened the door to a new opportunity for 2 children who knew only pain. The rain continued to fall for hours after the grandmother took the children home, as if nature itself was trying to wash away the traces of the tragedy that had just occurred. Deep down, I knew that not everything was resolved, that the children's emotional scars would be deep, and that the history they lived through could never be erased. But at least now there was hope, and in those moments, that hope was all that really mattered. Sometimes, the darkness in people's lives can be stopped by an act of courage, by a call for help, and by the intervention of those who still believe in justice. That night I stayed at the station, watching the rain fall as I thought about what I had witnessed. Despite the severity of the injuries, the doctors reported that the young girl would survive, and that gave me a breath of relief. But the memory of that house, the children's expressions, the father's vacant stare, remained with me, like an indelible reminder of the darkness that dwells in some people. The storm dissipated at dawn, but inside me, I knew there was something about that night that would never go away, a horror and hopelessness that would remain etched deep in my mind. My name is Mario. I am 50 years old and I am a writer. The night was dark, the kind where not even the lights on the poles seem able to pierce the density of the rain. Lightning briefly illuminated the sky and the sound of water on the roof of the car was deafening. I was driving on a normally busy highway, but the intensity of the storm had scared off most of the vehicles. There were barely a couple of cars in sight, and the rest of the road was empty, leaving only a bleak void, amplified by the storm. My mind wandered as the drops hit the windshield hard. The night was so close that I could barely make out the road, and visibility was practically nil. The headlights barely illuminated a few meters, and every second I felt more isolated, as if I were completely alone in a wet and silent trap. Suddenly, I felt something strange under my feet. The brake pedal stiffened, and the car began to slide slightly. I tried to press again, but the pedal no longer responded. At that moment, panic hit me hard. The brakes had failed, and the vehicle was still moving forward at a steady speed. In the middle of the storm, I began to lose control. The car was sliding faster and faster. I felt the roar of the engine as the vehicle gained momentum, careening out of control on a deserted highway. My hands clutched the steering wheel in desperation as I tried to keep the steering straight, but the wet, slippery asphalt made the car zigzag, threatening to veer off the road at any moment. Every curve was a challenge, every movement of the steering wheel a battle not to roll over in the middle of that storm. The raindrops were accumulating on the windshield, and although the windshield wipers were working at their best, they barely managed to improve my vision. I felt the fear growing inside me, turning into a suffocating sensation. I was accelerating unintentionally, trying to slow the vehicle with the momentum of my feet in a futile movement. In the distance, I saw the red lights of another car. With my heart in my throat, I realized that if I didn't slow down soon, I would catch up with it in a matter of seconds. I tried my best to control the steering wheel, but the car seemed to have a life of its own, moving mercilessly toward the vehicle in front of me. The road, wet and dangerous, amplified every second of tension. In the rain, my vision was blurring from the effort. The other driver seemed oblivious to the threat looming over him, and I knew I was about to cause a tragedy. A shudder ran through my body as, with a superhuman effort, I managed to turn the steering wheel and dodge the car by millimeters. I sped past, feeling the sound of the wind and rain hissing against my window, leaving the vehicle behind in a split second, barely aware of how close I had come to disaster. But the danger was not over. The road continued to descend, and with every meter the car gained more speed, sliding like an uncontrolled train. I tried to stay focused, looking for an exit, a place where I could stop, something that could slow me down, but the highway was surrounded by a metal railing that snaked along the track, like an iron prison that kept me locked in a deadly trajectory. All around me, the landscape seemed to be distorted by speed and rain, the trees and road signs blending into a mass of distorted shadows and lights. I felt my breath hitching, my pulse racing, and the sound of the storm grew louder, as if the sky itself was roaring against me. There was no way to slow down. The terror was turning into a kind of resignation, a dark acceptance that the end might be near. Suddenly, I saw a truck moving slowly in the right lane. I had no chance of avoiding it, so I tried to stay in the center, praying that my vehicle would not skid. The seconds were getting longer as I approached the inevitable collision. I felt time distorting, each instant stretching into an eternity of pure panic. The truck grew larger and larger in my field of vision, until, At the last second, I managed to swerve the car and skimmed past the edge of the truck, hearing the screech of metal as the side of my car brushed the massive structure. The impact caused him to completely lose control. The vehicle spun violently and began to skid. Everything became a confusion of lights, water, and shadows. The highway guardrail was fast approaching, and I knew that in a matter of seconds the car would crash into it. Clinging to the steering wheel, I braced myself for the crash, closing my eyes and expecting the worst. The blow was brutal. The car slammed into the metal railing, and the sound of twisting metal echoed in my ears as my body was violently shaken. I felt the pain radiating from every corner of my body, the air escaping my lungs and the weight of gravity pulling me forward. But miraculously, the car didn't go through the guardrail. I had finally stopped in the middle of that infernal storm. In my mind, I could barely process what had just happened. The adrenaline that had kept me alert faded, leaving in its place a deep exhaustion and the painful pounding of my heart. It wasn't long before the lights of other vehicles illuminated the scene. Amidst the rain, I barely made out the figures of people running toward me. I felt them carefully pulling me out of the car, their soothing voices barely a whisper through the ringing in my ears. I was rushed to the hospital, where the staff examined me precisely and calmly. As I regained a full sense of reality, I discovered that, despite a few bumps and scrapes, I had no serious injuries. It was as if the storm itself had absorbed all the impact, leaving me intact in a disaster that seemed inevitable. Looking at the photos of my car wrecked in the accident, I found it hard to believe that I had walked away virtually unscathed. The doctors told me I had been lucky, but deep down I knew it had been more than that. Something almost miraculous had happened, as if an invisible force had held me up, protecting me at just the right moment. That day, I understood the fragility of life and how sometimes fate seems to decide to give us a second chance when we least expect it. My name is Jorge. I am 33 years old and I am a driver. The night I discovered the truth, a storm was raging with full force, drenching the neighborhood in a dark and ominous blanket. The sound of the rain violently hitting the windows created a dense atmosphere, as if the sky itself knew what was about to happen. For months, something had been bothering me, an indefinable feeling that had been haunting me since I moved with my daughter to that house. The neighborhood seemed quiet, with ordinary families and seemingly safe streets. But every time my daughter played in the garden or went outside alone, there was something, a prickling feeling in the back of my neck, as if she were being watched. At first, I thought they were just unfounded suspicions, mere ideas floating around in my mind reflecting the natural overprotectiveness I felt for her. But as time went on, my fears began to take shape, and the next-door neighbor's presence became a weight that made me more uneasy than I wanted to admit. He was a reserved-looking man, always with his eyes downcast, the kind that goes unnoticed. He lived alone and rarely exchanged words with anyone. Sometimes, however, I noticed him peering out of the window at any time of the day, and although I never caught him looking directly at us, the suspicion grew until it became a persistent shadow. That night, when the clock struck 2 a.m, I heard a noise on the first floor. At first, I attributed it to the wind and rain, thinking that perhaps a window had been improperly closed. However, the sound was rhythmic, as if someone was trying to walk quietly, but failing in the attempt. My heart began to pound in my chest, and a sense of alertness came over me. I got up quietly, trying not to make a sound. The darkness of the house felt oppressive, as if every shadow hid something beyond the visible. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, trying to sharpen my senses in the midst of the storm. As I descended, a new sound, now more distinct, emerged from the hallway leading to my daughter's room. It was barely audible. I moved forward, trying to control my breathing as the footsteps became clearer, closer. As I reached the half-open door of his room, my gaze stopped on a dark figure, barely visible under the little light that filtered in from the window. My neighbor was there, a few meters away from my daughter, who was sleeping oblivious to what was going on. He stood in a strange posture, motionless, with his head cocked to one side, and his eyes fixed on her. It was as if he was enjoying that forbidden closeness, inhaling the stillness of the scene with a perverse delight. The man was so absorbed in his act that he did not notice my presence. A primitive impulse pushed me forward, eager to protect her, to uproot this sickly presence that had infiltrated our home. But I restrained myself, remembering the importance of not losing my head. I took a deep breath and backed up a step, controlling the panic burning inside me. I slid into the kitchen, where I kept an emergency phone, and with trembling fingers dialed the police number. The call lasted only a few seconds, but every second felt like an eternity. The voice on the other end promised me help, urged me to stay away from the intruder until they arrived. I returned to the foot of the stairs, hiding in the shadows, my body tense and my eyes fixed on the door to my daughter's room. From there, I could see him slowly approaching her bed, watching her, as if studying her. His hands were shaking strangely, and his breathing seemed ragged, as if he were trying to contain some impulse he could not control. My breathing was a whisper, but in that silence, everything seemed to resonate with intensity. My eyes kept watching her every movement, every tilt of her head, every step she took in my daughter's direction. Time was stretching out in a kind of slow, agonizing nightmare. I heard in the distance the sound of an approaching siren, breaking the tension in the air. The man turned his head with a jolt, aware of the sound that increased with each second. For the first time, I felt the weight of his eyes, dark and empty, filled with a darkness I had not noticed before. The expression on his face was a mixture of surprise and restrained fury. For an instant, the possibility that he might try to hurt me crossed my mind. But he froze, as if he knew there was no escape. The police arrived quickly, and, in a matter of minutes, he was led out of the house in handcuffs and with his eyes lowered as he tried to justify his presence there with incoherent and nonsensical words. The storm was still raging through the night, as if nature's fury reflected the chaos of the last few minutes. My daughter did not wake up at any time. Her deep sleep had kept her oblivious to everything that had happened, and I clung to that idea as a consolation. That night, after the police left, everything was calm again. I stood looking out the window where the neighbor used to watch silently. The police informed me that they had already received reports from other people, suspicions that something strange was going on in the neighborhood. Apparently, the man had been spying on other people as well, although he had never been caught in the act. My mind was flooded with questions, a myriad of dark thoughts about how I had allowed him to get so close without noticing him, how he had managed to go unnoticed for so long. I felt guilty, as if I had failed in my duty to protect her, and that thought became an impossible weight to ignore. The next day, I tried to explain the situation to my daughter as best I could without alarming her too much. I knew we would have to be strong to overcome this, to leave behind the feeling of vulnerability that enveloped us. The house felt different, less safe, as if the space itself had been stained by that unsettling presence. As time passed, I tried to regain my peace, although the image of my neighbor standing by my daughter's bed continued to haunt me at night, reminding me how fragile our tranquility was and how close we had come to something terrible. Despite attempts to remain calm, the memory of that night and the endless rain that accompanied it remained in my memory, like a constant warning that evil can hide even in the most unexpected place. My name is Victor. I am 41 years old, and I am a builder. The house was decorated with balloons and streamers, and the table was full of sweets and snacks. He had invited several of Valeria's friends, and although the storm was raging, the atmosphere inside was festive. Her smile lit up the room. As I watched her open the gifts, I felt a deep love and pride. However, among the acquaintances, there were two boys who didn't quite convince me. Their behavior was strange, and the way they looked at each other made me feel uncomfortable. Despite this, Valeria seemed to enjoy their company, and I decided to put my worries aside, at least for that night. The rain was still falling, and the wind was howling like an angry creature. While the boys chatted in the living room, I stayed in the kitchen, preparing some refreshments. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed at the door, I turned around, feeling a shiver run through me. The laughter and music stopped, and the festive atmosphere became tense. Without warning, the door burst open and a group of men entered, armed and with determined faces. Surprise and terror gripped me as I watched them advance. The rain was still falling, and the sound of their footsteps echoed in my ears. Instinctively, I moved toward Valeria, but before I could reach her, one of the men raised his gun. The scene became chaotic. The sound of laughter turned to panicked screams, and the air was filled with confusion. One of the men began to shout, looking for the two boys who were not convincing me. In an instant, I understood that their presence was no coincidence. The danger was here, in my own home. As the boys tried to escape out the back, chaos erupted all around me. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, and all I could think about was protecting Valeria. I ran towards her, but at that moment, the roar of a gunshot echoed in the room. The sound was deafening, and I felt like time stood still. Valeria fell to the ground, and my heart broke into 1,000 pieces. The world turned gray and blurry around me. I knelt down next to her, feeling the coldness of her skin and her gasping breath. The chaos continued, but I could only focus on her. Blood soaked her dress, and the laughter that once filled the house turned to screams of terror. As I tried to hold his head, despair overcame me. The armed men kept shouting, looking for the boys. Anguish turned to fury, and in my mind, one thought dominated. I had to protect her at all costs. The rain was falling harder and harder, as if the sky was crying with me. The house became a battlefield. The screams mixed with the sound of rain and the echo of gunshots. I tried to move, but panic paralyzed me. The image of Valeria on the ground, her face pale and her eyes closed, filled me with unbearable pain. The outside world faded away, and there was only the agony of losing my daughter. In the midst of the chaos, I managed to hear a familiar voice. It was the mother of one of the boys, who had arrived just in time to see the scene of horror unfolding before her eyes. In the midst of the confusion, she screamed for help, but the words were lost in the din of the storm. Desperation became an impulse. I had to do something. With every drop that fell, the feeling of helplessness became more intense. However, rage began to rise within me. I would not let it end like this. I stood up, feeling the pain in my chest. The house was full of smoke and screams, but I had to find these men. I had to understand why they had done this. In an instant of clarity, I understood that I could not let them get away with this. I left the room, leaving Valeria in the hands of her friend's mother. The image of her body on the floor was etched in my mind, and every step I took was a mixture of pain and determination. The men were in the living room, looking for the boys, but soon not finding them, they left. As I was trying to get out of the house to call for help, I heard a piercing scream. It was Valeria. My heart stopped. Her friend's mother was trying to help her, but there was nothing she could do. Rage took hold of me. With an impulse of fury, I ran for the door. The rain greeted me like an icy blanket, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get out. I needed to find help. The storm was a terrifying backdrop, but at that moment, I knew I had to fight for my daughter. I walked through the rain, feeling the water soaking me. The storm was still raging, and the sound of the water was an echo of my despair. I had to find help, and in my mind, there was only one purpose: to do justice for Valeria. As I ran, I saw the lights of a car approaching. It was a patrol car, and hope flared in my chest. Seeing the vehicle, I raised my hand, silently screaming for help. The officers got out of the car, and upon seeing my condition, they understood that something was very wrong. Without hesitation, they took me into the vehicle. As the car moved toward the house, I felt inside me a flame of determination. The storm had been fierce, but I was fierce too. And as I prepared to face whatever came, I knew that Valeria's memory would live on in me. As the morning enveloped me, the officers began to investigate the case. I kept informed, and although the pain of the loss was overwhelming, the thought of the perpetrators being caught gave me small comfort. I felt a deep desire for justice. Days later, I received a call that changed the course of my thoughts. The men had been caught. They had been identified and arrested thanks to the investigation, and the news filled me with a mixture of relief and fury. I knew I couldn't bring Valeria back, but at least I could see justice done. The storm in my heart was beginning to clear, although the sadness was still present. The trial took place amidst a torrent of emotions. The courtroom was filled with people who, like me, had been touched by the violence of these men. I listened to the testimonies, and every word was a reminder of what I had lost. But in the midst of the pain, I also felt the strength of the community, of those who came together to demand justice. The men were condemned, and the sentence was a grain of comfort amidst the ocean of my suffering. Now, instead of being a symbol of sadness, it became a reminder of the struggle I had faced. Valeria was gone, but her memory would live on in me, and her light would never be extinguished. Finally, as I walked out of the courthouse, I felt the weight of the storm begin to lift. The rain was falling gently, and though the pain of loss would always be present, I knew I had to honor my daughter's memory in some way. Life would go on, and though her absence filled me with sadness, her love would be my guide. I took a moment to breathe deeply, feeling the fresh air of the rain in my lungs. As I looked up at the sky, I understood that Valeria would always be with me, in every drop of rain, in every ray of light. I walked away from the courthouse, determined to find a new purpose in life. Valeria's memory would drive me to live fully, and although sadness would be part of my journey, so would the love we always shared. My name is Jose, I am 30 years old, and I am an ambulance driver. The rain was falling heavily that night, covering the city with a dark veil. From the cab of the ambulance, the sound of the drops hitting the windshield was the only thing that kept me aware that I was still awake. It was past midnight, and the shift seemed to go on forever. The city I worked in was not easy, especially in those areas where violence and poverty went hand in hand, where sometimes rescues not only involved saving lives, but also safeguarding one's own. When the emergency call came in, adrenaline rushed through me, as always. An injured man in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods. It was the kind of warning that we ambulance drivers dreaded, but which, over time, we had learned to deal with. Without thinking too much, I turned on the sirens and headed in the direction indicated, dodging the few traffic lights that flashed like shadows on the deserted street. The rain made it difficult to see clearly, and every turn felt like a challenge between speed and control. Upon arrival, I found a man lying on the pavement, his face covered with blood and his eyes barely open. Wasting no time, we loaded him onto the stretcher and secured him in the back of the ambulance. His condition was critical. We had to act fast. The rain continued to fall, relentlessly, as I got behind the wheel and began the drive to the hospital. The streets were deserted and seemed endless. I moved forward as fast as I could, without taking my eyes off the road, while my partner tried to keep the man conscious and stabilize his signs. At that moment, my only concern was to get to the hospital before his condition worsened. There was no time for distractions or mistakes. However, when we were halfway there, I noticed some lights in the rearview mirror approaching at high speed. At first, I thought it might be some other vehicle in a hurry, perhaps someone escaping the rain. But the lights were not only approaching, they were also moving erratically, as if trying to block my path. Within seconds, the lights were too close, and a pickup truck pulled alongside me, trying to pull me over. An unfamiliar chill ran through me. It was clear that this was not a simple traffic accident. Someone was intercepting us, and their intentions did not look good. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but the van continued to chase us, hitting the sides of the ambulance at every opportunity. I felt the weight of the rain, now thicker and heavier, as if the storm itself was complicit in what was about to happen. Before I could react, another vehicle appeared in front of us, completely blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, barely managing to stop the ambulance before impact. The tension was unbearable. The injured man in the back let out a barely audible groan, like a silent reminder that my mission was to save him. But he was trapped, with no escape. The door of the ambulance was abruptly opened, and I heard the sound of footsteps and firm, merciless voices. I caught a glimpse of several black-clad figures entering, surrounding the wounded man. For an instant, I felt the impulse to intervene, to try to stop what was happening. But fear paralyzed my muscles. I was defenseless, alone in the middle of the storm, with those armed men, determined to finish him off. My gaze remained fixed on the rearview mirror as I watched one of them approach, and, without further ado, unloaded his fury on the man's weak body, ending his existence in a single brutal movement. It was a cold, swift, and merciless execution. I did not know who they were, or why they wanted his life, but at that moment, I understood that the wounded man had been sentenced since before he received the first wound. What I didn't understand was the part I had played in all of this. The rain kept pounding on the roof of the ambulance, like a dull echo of what had just happened. When those men drove off, leaving me in the middle of the road with the man's lifeless body, I was paralyzed. The blood mixed with the storm water, forming a dark puddle that reflected the lights of the ambulance, like a distorted image of the night. My hands trembled. Helplessness overcame me. I had witnessed an act of violence so brutal and calculated that the whole world seemed to have changed in that instant. After a few minutes, I managed to muster enough courage to get back behind the wheel. I knew I had to inform the police, that they would take care of the formalities, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me. The story I would have to tell, the look on the officers' faces when they heard what had happened, the guilt of having witnessed something so horrible without being able to do anything about it. I drove the ambulance slowly back. The sound of the siren now seemed empty in the desolation of the city. Luckily, those men did not attack me or my fellow paramedic. As soon as they finished what they came to do, they left the ambulance without saying a word, as if I was invisible, as if everything that night was strictly planned to focus on their only goal, to end that man's life. As I watched their silhouettes vanish in the rain, leaving us alone with the lifeless body in the back of the ambulance, a strange mixture of relief and terror washed over me. I did not understand why the man had been the victim of something so brutal, or who his executioners were. I only knew that the ferocity with which they acted left a mark on me, as if they had left their trace not only in the ambulance, but in my memory. I drove back to the hospital in silence, the ambulance lights reflecting off the wet road, while the echoing rain seemed to amplify the emptiness of what had just happened. The police took care of everything, but their questions echoed in my head again and again with no answers. I couldn't tell them anything meaningful. I didn't know the motive for the act, or who the men were who committed it, or even the name of the man who had been executed. After that night, every time an emergency call went out and I had to direct the ambulance to that area, I was overcome with terror. I felt a paralyzing fear at the thought of the possible dangers that could await me. That incident had shown me the stark reality of what it was like to work in such a dangerous area. My job, once my way of helping, had become a constant journey between duty and fear. That rainy night had become an indelible memory, a lingering shadow that accompanied me at every turn. I knew I had to move on, that this was part of life in a place like that, but I also knew that my perspective had changed forever. My name is Ronald. I am 26 years old and I work in a supermarket. That night was tinged with a deep black, the kind of dense, total darkness that turns shadows into sinister figures. The rain was coming down in heavy bursts, pounding the windows and roof of my house in a monotonous symphony that, at any other time, I would have found soothing. But that night was different. My senses were alert, and my breathing held, as if my body knew something my mind had not yet grasped. I settled into bed, trying to calm myself, to tell myself that the weather was the only reason I felt this way. Nervous and tense. My dog, a German shepherd named Max, was in his corner of the room, curled up, though his body seemed restless, tense under his wet fur from the brief walk we had taken before bedtime. I closed my eyes, ready to let go of that strange feeling of discomfort. But then Max began to growl. The sound was low at first, a low growl, but enough to make me uneasy. I opened my eyes in the gloom, watched as Max slowly sat up. His ears were erect, his body in an alert position. I tried to relax, telling myself that I had probably heard a normal noise, perhaps the snapping of a branch and the force of the wind. But when his growls turned into loud, low barks, I knew something was wrong. I got out of bed and walked to the window, trying to remain calm. As I approached, Max stood beside me, his barks echoing in the room, bouncing off the empty walls and drowning amidst the sound of the rain falling in curtains of water in front of the window. I looked out into the back garden, which stretched into the gloom, barely visible under the flickering light of a distant pole. There, amidst the mud and wet grass, I distinguished two figures. They were human shadows, motionless in the rain, like statues that seemed to watch over the house from the bottom of the garden. Fear ran through me like an icy shiver. I didn't recognize their silhouettes. They were strangers. Two people in the middle of the night, standing on my property for no reason. The first thought that crossed my mind was that someone had decided to break in, perhaps taking advantage of the storm and the darkness. I felt trapped, helpless, with adrenaline coursing through my veins as I tried to think of what I should do. The nearest figure then moved, taking a step toward the house. I felt the urge to step back, to hide in the shadows, but fear left me paralyzed. The seconds passed slowly, and with each one my thoughts grew darker, more desperate. Max's barking increased and his eyes were fixed on the intruders, as if he understood the danger we were in. At that moment, the second individual also took a step, approaching the first, and together they advanced a few more meters. My thoughts were scattered, frantically searching for a solution. I could not see their faces, and that made the terror deepen. I did not know who they were, or what their intentions were. For a moment I wondered if they were common criminals or if there was something else, some personal reason that I did not know. Years of living alone in that house had isolated me, and I barely spoke to my neighbors. Somehow, the loneliness now felt like a heavy burden, like a choice that had left me vulnerable. The figures stopped again, and for an instant, I thought that perhaps they had changed their minds, that they would move away. But the wind changed direction, and the sound of their footsteps mingled with the rain, advancing closer and closer. Each step felt like an inverted hourglass, a countdown to something inevitable. I didn't have much choice, so I backed away quietly, grabbing Max by his collar and dragging him into a corner where he couldn't be seen from the windows. I felt his body vibrate under my hands, his tense grunts echoing my own fears. Clinging to him, I tried to think clearly. The storm continued, and his barking only seemed to make the situation worse. I feared that strangers might hear me or see some light through the house. However, my pounding heartbeat mingled with the insistent rain as I imagined 1,000 ways they could enter, each more terrible than the last. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the back door. It was a sharp, resounding knock, as if someone had pushed the door hard, trying to open it without making too much noise. The sound bounced in my ears, and my breathing became shallow. I felt a mixture of anger and terror, a desperate reaction to the impending danger. If they got in, there wasn't much I could do. The idea of confronting them seemed crazy. There were two of them, and my only company was Max. Another knock resounded on the door, this time louder. There was the squeak of metal, and for a second, I thought the lock would not hold. Images of what might happen next swirled in my mind, each one worse than the last. Clutching Max's leash, I headed for the kitchen and grabbed the only thing that seemed minimally useful, a large knife I kept in the drawer. I moved with the gun in my hand, trying to convince myself that if they came in, I would at least have a chance to protect myself. The sound of the rain mingled with the sound of the pounding, and for a moment, I thought about running for the door and facing them at once, ending the uncertainty that was destroying my nerves. But I didn't. I stood in the corner of the house, waiting, with Max growling beside me, and the pounding getting louder and louder at the door. After what seemed like hours, the knocking stopped. I dared to peek out, peering through a crack in the window. The two figures had moved away from the door and were now backing away, losing themselves in the gloom of the night and the storm. The next thing I did was to call the police, still with my voice cracking. I calmly explained what had happened. Two intruders had tried to break into my house in the middle of the night. As I spoke, Max stood beside me, calmer now, but alert, as if he understood that the nightmare of that night was not quite over. The officers arrived quickly, taking my testimony and checking the perimeter of the house. My nerves began to calm a bit as I watched them inspect the property, looking for any trace of the strangers. While one of the officers was talking to me, another was checking for footprints in the yard, following the muddy footprints the intruders had left behind. To my surprise, after a few minutes, one of the officers announced that they had located the suspects a few streets away. The two men had been seen trying to hide in an alley, shivering in the rain that was still falling intermittently. They put up no resistance when the police approached them, and after a quick inspection, they found a bag with money and several valuables. I soon understood that these were no ordinary burglars looking for isolated houses. It turned out that they had robbed a nearby store just minutes before they arrived in my yard. Finding themselves cornered by the storm and with no place to hide, they had sought shelter on my property, trying to force their way in to keep out of sight. My house on the periphery of the neighborhood had simply been an emergency choice in their desperation to escape the downpour and the imminent risk of being caught. The police assured me that they had recovered the money and items that the intruders had taken from the store. That bag of rain-soaked bills and stolen items was the evidence that would link them directly to the crime. The agents reassured me that they were not likely to bother me again, as they were now facing burglary and trespassing charges. After they left, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The experience of that night had been terrifying, but I was comforted to know that the intruders had not been there with the direct intention of harming me. In the end, what I had felt was the echo of fear, the fragility of life alone. Max, faithful as ever, remained by my side, and I understood that, despite everything, I was not really alone. That night had been a test, a reminder of the vulnerability of an isolated life, and as I cuddled Max, I promised myself to be prepared for whatever fate might bring me in the future. My name is Daniel. I am 39 years old and I am a rescuer. That night it rained as if the sky was ready to purge the whole world. A fierce storm that darkened the city and turned the streets into rivers of shadows and water. Lightning briefly illuminated the cityscape, revealing desolate buildings and the flickering of traffic lights on the wet asphalt. I was in my apartment, listening to the rain pounding on the windows, lost in a mixture of disbelief and horror. I had received the news that very afternoon, abruptly and with a coldness that left me in a state of shock. My lifelong friend, someone with whom I shared countless memories, had been arrested. He was a man accused of something unthinkable, serial murder. I tried to process what I had heard, mentally going over the headlines that were gradually invading the media and television, each word a more intense shock than the last. The Black Moon Killer, as he had been called, was responsible for at least 5 deaths, all young, vulnerable women. The investigations had been going on for years, and now he was at the center of that abyss of horror. I remember meeting Marcos at school. He was a quiet, shy, and withdrawn boy, but we had a special connection. We shared many things, from a love of horror movies to a certain fascination with the strange and the unknown. Over the years, our friendship continued, albeit intermittently. When we finished college, our paths went in different directions. He moved to another city, and I moved on with my life, my work, and my projects. We saw each other only on special occasions, and although we no longer spoke every day, there was always that feeling of familiarity, of camaraderie, or so I thought. The rain continued to fall heavily, and as the thunder roared in the distance, I was overcome with a mixture of haunting memories. They were fragments of moments past, insignificant details that now seemed to take on a new dark meaning. I remembered an afternoon, years ago, when he and I were strolling through the park, and in his gaze there was something unusual, a kind of intensity that, at the time, I failed to identify. At the time, I thought it was just a stray expression, one of those things you don't question, but now it felt like a latent warning. That night, I plunged into a series of dark thoughts, trying to understand if there were ever signs I should have noticed. I wondered if I could have done something, if I should have confronted him at some point about the odd comments he occasionally made, those remarks that, at the time, I had dismissed as black humor or mere eccentricities. Marcos was always reserved, hard to read, and there were many things about his personal life that he never shared with me. But I never imagined that the darkness that sometimes crept up on him could be something so real, so frightening. The night was advancing, and, although I tried to remain serene, a restlessness was beginning to take hold of me. I got up, walking around the apartment, watching the storm intensify outside. In an attempt to distract myself, I went through the few things I kept from our friendship, searching for some answer in the objects that became mute witnesses of our shared history. I found photos, small souvenirs of trips and meetings. It all seemed so normal, so innocent. But in light of what I knew now, it frightened me to think of the abysses hidden in the people closest to me. With each flash of lightning that illuminated my living room, I felt the darkness inside me grow heavier, more real. I wondered how he had been able to hide it so well. Was it possible that he had led such a complex double life without anyone noticing? The answer was obvious and frightening. Yes, he had done it, and I, his lifelong friend, had seen nothing. At that moment, a thought flashed through me like an icy bolt of lightning. Had I, on some level, deceived myself? Had I chosen to ignore signs, warnings? I picked up the phone and searched the news. There they were, the reports detailing the horror of his crimes, a cold and meticulous story about the disappearances, the traces of violence, and the discovery of irrefutable evidence in his apartment. Images of the sites where they found the victims began to fill my mind, graphic descriptions of what he had done, how he had observed them before stalking, and finally attacking them. My hands trembled as I absorbed the information. Suddenly, I noticed that something didn't add up. Between the dates of the crimes and the days he had visited me, there were chilling coincidences. There were times when he had called me right after one of those deaths occurred, and I never thought about the possibility that he was using our friendship as an alibi, or worse, as a place to take refuge after each heinous act. The thought made me sick. To think that perhaps in those days when he came to see me, he had already committed one of those atrocities. And I, not knowing anything, received him as always, sharing laughter and memories, completely ignoring the monster he was hiding. I stayed on the couch, watching the storm reach its fiercest point. The darkness in the room was thick, crushing. With every flash of lightning, it seemed that something was moving in the shadows, that someone else was there with me, watching me from some dark corner. I was filled with paranoia, thinking that, although Marcos was now behind bars, his shadow, his presence, was permeating my life. I couldn't shake that idea. I had shared so much time with him, trusted him, and now I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everything I had known about him was a lie. The following days were a blur of contradictory emotions. I couldn't sleep well, and every time I closed my eyes I saw his face, but not the face I knew, but a distorted, cold one, capable of indescribable acts. The news continued to cover her case with increasingly disturbing details, while the media dug up fragments of her life, details I never knew, things she never shared with me. I began to review every interaction with him, every conversation, every moment, looking for answers, for some clue that I had overlooked. But in the end, all I found was an abysmal emptiness, the realization that I had never really known my friend. His true personality was a mystery, a mask so well constructed that no one, not even I, his closest friend, had been able to discover. The storm continued for several nights, and with each downpour I felt the darkness of his story clinging more to my life. I felt a kind of hopelessness, a deep sadness, as I realized that not only had I lost a friend, but that I had lost him to something so dark and terrifying. It was as if the rain washed away every trace of our friendship, every memory, leaving only the cold, echoing connection that had been tainted by the monstrosity of his actions. I decided to get away from everything that reminded me of him. I left behind those memories, tore up the photos, and removed every trace of his existence in my life. But deep down, I knew that I could never completely escape what I had discovered. His shadow, the trace of his existence, would always be there, in some corner of my memory, like an indelible mark, like the distant echo of a friendship that had become a nightmare. My name is Jaime. I'm 47 years old and I work in a fire station. The sirens sounded just as the rain began to fall heavily. The drops were hitting the barracks window with a rhythm that, under other circumstances, would have been soothing. But that night, the call came with a familiar address, a quiet neighborhood. I hurried to put on my gear as the others climbed into the truck. The adrenaline was almost as thick as the humidity in the air. The trip to the fire site was brief, but the weight of every second that passed felt like an eternity. The rain was relentless, and it seemed as if the sky was bearing down on us, as if nature itself was trying to warn us. As we got closer, I could make out the orange glow and plumes of smoke rising into the dark sky, contrasting with the torrent of falling water. The scene was surreal, the fire defying the fury of the storm. As they got out of the truck, the heat of the fire clashed with the cold humidity of the rain, creating an unreal and suffocating atmosphere. The burning structure was a 2-story house, old and battered wood, as if it was already tired of standing the test of time. I knew that every second was crucial and, as my colleagues unrolled the hoses and prepared the equipment, I rushed inside. Something about the place gave me a strange uneasiness, a knot in my stomach that was unusual for my job. The interior of the house was in semi-darkness, but the dense smoke turned the darkness into an almost tangible fog. I advanced cautiously, listening to the creak of wood groaning under the pressure of the flames. I knew the fire was advancing fast, devouring every nook and cranny in its path, and though the rain pounded furiously on the roof and windows, inside those walls, the water felt like a distant illusion. My boots echoed on the wet, slippery ground, and suddenly something in the air changed. A distinct, sour smell alerted me. It wasn't just the distinctive aroma of burning wood, but something else. I froze for a moment, trying to process the strange mixture of smells that invaded my lungs. I decided to move forward, but every step I took increased that feeling of danger that I could not explain to myself. Then I saw it. In one of the rooms, half burned, I found a small figure covered by debris. I got close enough to notice that it was a mannequin, somewhat mangled, probably by the fire. For a moment, I wondered if someone had tried something sinister before the fire. That figure there, in that place, was grotesque. I felt it was watching me, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, because as I approached, a thud echoed above the crackling of the flames. The ceiling beam had given way, and within seconds I was trapped. The weight of the burnt wood pressed on my shoulders, immobilizing me. I tried to struggle, but there was no way to free myself. My breathing quickened, and the air became thicker and heavier. My radio had shattered in the fall, leaving me without communication with my companions. The only company at that moment was the orange glow of the fire and the incessant rain pounding on the roof. Smoke filled my lungs, making me cough and making breathing even more difficult. I began to lose track of time. The heat was unbearable and my strength was failing. I kept thinking about that strange scene I had found, about the mannequin, about the way it seemed to have been placed on purpose, like a warning or some kind of macabre game. My mind began to wander, to imagine who could have done such a thing. Perhaps the fire had not been an accident, but a deliberate act, a trap set for someone like me to fall into. In the midst of the smoke, I could make out a figure moving in the gloom. It was not one of my companions. It was someone who was not wearing protective gear and who was moving calmly, as if the fire and chaos around him would not affect him. I tried to shout, but the smoke and wood above me drowned out my words. The figure advanced, indifferent to my presence, and only then did I understand that it was not there to help me. Panic took hold of me. I began to writhe, to struggle against the structure that imprisoned me. My hands trembled, my breathing became faster, and my vision began to blur. I heard my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as the silhouette approached. When he was close enough, I could see something in his hands, a can of some kind of accelerant. Horror paralyzed me. Not only had this person set the fire, but now, in front of me, he was planning to intensify the flames, to make sure I had no way out. He looked at me without expression, as if I were only part of his work, one more detail in his macabre spectacle. He poured the liquid sparingly around me and lit a spark. The last image that held my mind was the glow reflected in his eyes, as the fire surrounded me, intensified and fanned by the substance he had thrown. At that moment, I thought there was no salvation for me. As the fire devoured everything around it, I felt my strength leave me. The smoke was so thick that it seeped through every crack in my mask, and my eyes, tired of trying to stay open, began to close. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was that orange glow and the echo of my own slow, heavy heartbeat. I awoke to whispers and voices I could barely understand. My body was aching. Every breath burned as if I was still trapped in that hell. I tried to open my eyes and felt the artificial light of the hospital violently penetrate my vision. Beside me, my co-workers watched me with a mixture of relief and concern. They told me that they managed to get in at the last moment, when the flames seemed about to consume me completely. I had lost consciousness, but they arrived just in time to pull me out of the inferno. As I tried to process what had happened, I told them about the figure I saw, the person who had watched me from the shadows with that can of accelerant in his hands. The idea that someone might have deliberately set the fire, that someone had waited to see me trapped and vulnerable, chilled my blood. But apparently none of my colleagues had seen that person. They searched every corner of the house and checked security cameras on nearby streets, but found no trace of anyone suspicious. Some thought that exhaustion and trauma had played a trick on me, that perhaps my mind, under the pressure of the moment, had created that figure as a hallucination. But I knew what I had seen. I remembered those cold eyes, the calmness with which I had sprayed the accelerant around me, almost as if I was enjoying the scene. With no evidence or witnesses, I remained silent, questioning whether it had all been a stress-induced nightmare, or whether indeed someone so perverse had been there, so close to me, watching with the intention of leaving me with no way out. Uncertainty stayed with me long after that day. Perhaps I would never know the truth, but every time I hear the sound of the rain hitting a window, I feel again that indescribable fear. The fear of not knowing if that face was real or a simple creation of my mind trapped between fire and despair. My name is Jose. I am 29 years old, and I like outdoor activities. One day in the year 2022, I went into the mountains with the intention of disconnecting, of escaping the noise of the city. But there, among trees that seemed to whisper dark secrets, I felt I had made the wrong decision. The afternoon had started with clear skies, promising a pleasant walk. However, the weather changed drastically. Clouds gathered, hiding the sun, and the wind began to howl through the branches. I decided I should turn back, but the trail I had followed had become unrecognizable in the gloom. The rain had turned it to slippery mud, and my sense of direction had vanished. As I advanced, the air became thick, laden with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. I felt watched, as if something else was in the forest, lurking in the shadows. My heart was pounding, and every rustle of the branches made me turn my head, fearing what I might find. After several hours of aimless wandering, my legs began to weaken. I sought shelter and found a small cave, barely big enough to fit my body. I settled inside, wet and shivering, and tried to calm my breathing. The rain was still falling, and the echo of the water bounced off the stone walls, creating a monotonous rhythm that did not help calm my mind. The cave was dark, and the silence was almost deafening. As the night settled in, I realized that I was not alone. There was something in the darkness, a presence that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was my imagination, fueled by loneliness and fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else in this place. Something I didn't want to be there. As time passed, my mind began to wander. I remembered the stories I had heard about the forest, tales of missing hikers, of beings lurking in the dark. I told myself they were just myths, but the tension in the air made my thoughts grow darker. I wondered if I would ever get out of here, if someone would come looking for me. As the rain continued to fall, the ground slowly flooded. The sound of the water became louder and louder, almost like an incessant murmur. It was then that I heard something else, a sound that was not the rain. It was a rustling, a footstep. It was not an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. My heart stopped for a moment. I was silent, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to stop. The rustling came closer, and in my mind images began to emerge of what it could be. A man, a human being, a murderer perhaps. Newspaper stories of individuals getting lost in the woods and never returning came back to haunt me. I focused on the cave entrance, my eyes straining to see something in the gloom. The sound stopped. The silence became a blank canvas, and my anxiety increased. I didn't know if I was alone, or if danger was just a few steps away. The rain continued, but now it seemed like a distant background to my growing fear. Every little noise, every falling drop of water, made me jump. I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here waiting for this presence to decide to approach. Carefully, I tried to move toward the cave entrance, each movement a struggle against the mud clinging to my boots. As I peered out, the world outside was a chaos of shadows and flashing lights reflected in the accumulated water. The cold chilled me to the bone, but I couldn't stand still. I had to find a way out. I walked out of the cave, the icy air sticking to my skin. Every step I took in the mud was a challenge. The rain was intensifying, and the wind was hitting my face. I looked to the horizon for some sign of life, but all I saw were trees, soaked and silent. Panic began to take hold of me. Suddenly I heard the cracking sound again. This time louder, closer. My survival instinct kicked in. I started running, stumbling among the roots and slippery stones. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get out of there, out of this darkness that seemed to swallow everything. The rain blinded me and the night enveloped me like a heavy blanket. As I ran, I realized that there was no clear path, and each direction seemed to take me deeper into the forest. The feeling of being chased intensified. I looked back, but saw no one. However, the fear continued to fuel my desperation. I knew I had to find a safe place, a refuge where I could think. Finally, the moon's glow filtered through the clouds, illuminating the space in front of me. In the center was an old fallen log, big enough to hide me. I slid behind it, still shivering. Now the sound of the water seemed to me like a song in the midst of the overwhelming silence. I stood there, huddled, waiting. Every rustle of the branches, every movement of the wind made me jump. The fear of being found kept me alert. Just when I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, I heard footsteps again. These were different. They were heavy, determined, and approaching me. My heart stopped. I remained motionless, holding my breath, trying to make myself invisible. The figure appeared, a dark shadow moving confidently through the trees. I could not make out its features, but its presence was undeniable. I felt terror envelop me as I watched it approach. The footsteps stopped. The figure seemed to be looking for something, perhaps me. The rain continued to fall, but now it was a mere murmur compared to the pounding of my heart. The figure moved back and forth, like a predator stalking its prey. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back as I tried to keep silent. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure walked away, disappearing into the shadows. My mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. I couldn't stand there, but I couldn't risk being seen either. I waited, holding my breath. Every second felt like an hour. Luckily, the rain began to slow down, and the silence of the forest deepened. I took the opportunity and slipped behind the log, moving slowly toward the edge of the clearing. I had to find the path back, something that would lead me to the safety of civilization. The way back was a challenge, but every step I took filled me with hope. The rain had turned the ground into a quagmire, and my boots were sinking into the mud, but I couldn't stop. The image of that figure kept haunting my mind, and the thought that I might meet her again drove me on. Then I found a clearer trail, one that appeared to have been used by other hikers. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't stop looking back, fearing that shadow would return. With each step, the feeling of being followed slowly faded, but my mind remained alert. Dawn began to filter through the trees, illuminating the world with a faint glow. I began to hear voices in the distance. My heart raced. There were others. I hurried toward the sound, my legs tired but propelled by the hope of being rescued. When I finally reached a group of hikers, the feeling of relief was overwhelming. They looked at me with surprise and quickly understood that I was in trouble. As I got closer, the sun began to shine timidly through the clouds. I had survived, but the images of the night before would continue to haunt me. As the others helped me out of the forest, I couldn't help but look back. The darkness of the forest still seemed a place full of secrets, and I knew that, although I had escaped, the experience would change me forever. The fear of the unknown, of what lurks in the dark, would never completely go away. And in the back of my mind, a question lingered. What had been that figure in the night, and how many more might be lurking in the shadows? My name is Juan. I am 38 years old and I work in real estate. That day, the rain was lashing hard against my car windows, as if the sky was trying to warn me of something. It was a dark and stormy afternoon, ideal for a home seller like me, who always found the perfect weather to show properties in a cozy atmosphere. But this time was different. The house I had to show that night was one of the oldest in the neighborhood, a mansion that had sat vacant for years. No one wanted to buy it, and I was beginning to wonder why. As I approached the site, the silhouette of the house was silhouetted against the leaden sky. Its dust-covered windows looked like empty eyes watching me as I parked. There was a story behind the place, but often those stories were just rumors people told to add a little drama to their lives. But something about this house made me uneasy. Maybe it was the feeling of my footsteps echoing on the wet asphalt, or my thoughts getting lost in the murmur of the rain. As I got out of the car, the rain intensified, drenching me quickly. I ran to the driveway, where the wooden door creaked ominously as I opened it. The interior was dark and cold, even though the air conditioning was off. Everything was covered in a layer of dust that seemed to have remained untouched for years. I took out my flashlight and turned it on, illuminating a wide but desolate hallway. The walls were adorned with old portraits of people I did not know. Their gazes seemed to follow me as I moved forward. Immediately a shiver ran through me. I forced myself to concentrate. I needed to sell this house, and I wasn't going to let the shadows of the past scare me away. The rain was still pounding hard, and the sound mingled with the creaking of the wood beneath my feet. I began to walk through the rooms, mentally describing each one as I would in a presentation. The living room was spacious, with a stone fireplace that had surely seen better days. The kitchen was equipped, though the dust on the appliances indicated that no one had cooked there in a long time. As I walked through, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. When I got to the second floor, I heard the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the house that actually made me even more nervous. I decided to inspect the master bedroom. It was an impressive space, with large windows overlooking a garden that had been abandoned for years. The rain was falling on the glass, creating an almost hypnotic effect, and I lost myself in the sound, forgetting for a moment the reason for my visit. It was then that I heard a noise coming from downstairs. A thud, as if something had fallen. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath as my senses sharpened. The rain was still falling, but the sound faded. I told myself it must be my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in an empty house. I decided to go ahead with the visit. A salesman can't afford to scare easily, I thought. But as I left the bedroom, I heard the knock again, this time louder, accompanied by a murmur. I couldn't ignore that feeling that I wasn't alone. The thought that someone might be in the house went through me like a bolt of lightning. I began to descend the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silence. When I reached the lobby, I saw that the front door was ajar. A shiver ran through my body. Was anyone there? The rain was still falling, and the wind seemed to have grown in intensity. I approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight illuminated the outside, but there was no sign of life. However, I could sense that someone or something had been there. I decided to close the door and lock it. The lock creaked and clicked into place, but my mind was still uneasy. I headed back out into the hallway, but at that moment the sound of the knock was repeated, this time closer. It was as if someone was moving furniture in the house. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. I needed to get out of there. As I headed for the exit, I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned quickly, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the shadow. But there was nothing, just the dust-covered walls and the portraits that seemed to be smiling mockingly at me. My mind began to wander. What if someone had been waiting for me to arrive? What if the story behind the house wasn't just rumors? Desperate to get out, I went back to the door, but something stopped me. A voice in my head told me that I couldn't leave without knowing what was going on. So I plucked up my courage and decided to investigate where the noise was coming from. I walked cautiously toward the room that had been to my left as I entered. It was a small study, full of furniture covered with dust and cobwebs. When I arrived at the studio, the atmosphere became even colder. The flashlight illuminated a table in the center, full of yellowed papers. I approached to inspect them, and what I saw froze me completely. They were newspaper clippings, all about disappearances in the area. My heart raced, and the sense of danger became palpable. As I was reading the clippings, I heard a new noise, an almost imperceptible whisper. It was as if someone was speaking softly, too low to understand. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the room, but still saw no one. Panic began to take hold of me. I returned to the entrance, but on the way, the sound of the whisper became louder, more insistent. It was a male voice, low and threatening. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed like a mere murmur compared to the voice echoing in my mind. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to move. Memories of the disappearances began to flood my mind, and the thought of being the next victim became a terrifying reality. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I took one last look around the house and headed for the door. But just as I was about to open it, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped me completely. The sound of the rain became a deafening roar, and the silence in the house became oppressive. I felt a shiver run through my body. In the darkness, the voice became clearer, closer. It was as if it was right behind me. I couldn't stay there. I flung open the door, and the rain hit me like a violent murmur. I ran out, plunging into the chaos of the weather, without looking back. I ran to my car, feeling that something was following me, but I didn't dare look. The rain was pouring down torrentially, and the air was permeated with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. I reached the car, opened the door, and climbed inside, shivering with cold and terror. The house was left behind. Its dark and menacing silhouette vanished in the storm. I started the engine and sped out of there, but the fear still haunted me. As I drove, my mind was caught up in the madness of what I had experienced. The disappearances, the voice, the feeling of being watched. It was as if the house hadn't let me go so easily. As I drove down the road, the landscape became familiar. But even in the safety of my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking. When I finally got home, the storm had begun to subside. I sat on the couch, shivering, my mind filled with images of that house and the newspaper clippings. That place had been a hunting ground for someone, and I had come so close to falling into their trap. The thought terrified me. I set out to do more research on that house. I spent hours searching the internet, and what I found only added to my horror. Not only had there been disappearances, but some of the missing had been found years later, mutilated, their bodies stripped of any trace of humanity. The house had been a place of horror for many, a haven for a serial killer who had been active in the area for years. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice I had heard, how it had slithered into my mind like a snake. That night, I realized that the house was not just an empty structure. It was a haven for fear, a place where shadows came alive and secrets lurked in every corner. Weeks passed, but the experience continued to haunt me. Every time it rained, I remembered that mansion, and the feeling of being watched returned. The terror had left an imprint on my mind, and though I tried to forget it, I could not. The thought that the killer was still at large, that he might be lurking, kept me awake at night. I decided to leave the business of selling houses. I couldn't bear the thought of setting foot on a property again, of facing the echoes of the past that still echoed in my mind. The rain became a constant reminder of what had happened, and with each storm, it reawakened the fear I had felt that night. Eventually, I moved to a different city, away from the mansion and its dark secrets. But sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain pounded on the windows, I could swear I heard that voice. A voice that told me I could never escape the past, that it would always be just around the corner, waiting for the perfect moment to catch me again. My name is Xavier. I am 40 years old and I am a contractor for the city. The rain was pouring down, pounding on the roof of the family home as if the sky was mourning the death of my parents. I was sitting in the living room, surrounded by memories and shadows, feeling the weight of loneliness after their funeral. It had been a week since the last whisper of life left their bodies, and though sadness consumed me, there was something else that troubled me: the inheritance. My younger brother, Diego, had arrived home days before, his face a mirror of mine, but his eyes reflected something darker. He had always been the most impulsive among us, the one who made decisions without thinking of the consequences. The inheritance our parents left us was considerable, and I couldn't ignore the glint of greed in his eyes when talking about the family property, the accumulated savings and the jewelry that had belonged to our mother. The storm outside intensified, and the thunder rumbled like a harbinger of the horror to come. The house, which had once been a shelter, now resembled a prison. Darkness gripped every corner, and every creak of the rafters made me think something terrible was coming. I got up from the couch, determined not to let the sadness consume me. I had to do something. I had to occupy my mind. I decided to take a walk around the house, checking each room. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed that the window was ajar, letting in a blast of cold, damp air. I closed the window, feeling a chill run through me. The house seemed to whisper secrets I didn't want to hear. Diego was in his room, and although I couldn't see him, I felt his presence in every corner of the house like a shadow. Arriving upstairs, I found myself in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The rain was still pounding mercilessly, and thunder rumbled, filling the air with palpable tension. I stopped in front of the door to my parents' room, the place where so many memories had been woven. The door was ajar, and an almost irrepressible impulse made me push it open. The room was silent, the sheets still unraveled where my parents had been. I looked around, searching for something that would connect me to them once again. It was then that I noticed a small box on the desk, covered in dust. I opened it carefully, and inside I found letters, photos, and documents that told the story of our family. But what caught my attention most was one document in particular: a will. As I read it, my heart stopped. My parents had left everything in inheritance to both of us, but the document contained a clause stipulating that if one of us died, the other would inherit the entire estate. An oppressive feeling came over me, and a shiver ran down my spine. The greed I had seen in Diego's eyes was not just a perception, it was a real risk. I decided it was time to confront my brother. I went downstairs, my mind filled with dark thoughts. When I reached his room, I felt a knot in my stomach. I found him sitting on the bed, a look of concentration on his face. The darkness seemed to envelop him, and in that moment, I understood that I was about to cross a line I never thought I would cross. Diego looked up, and his face lit up with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The tension between us was palpable, and although we did not exchange words, the silence spoke for us. Something in his look told me that the storm was not just a natural phenomenon, it was a reflection of what was brewing inside him. I returned to the living room, trying to calm myself. I knew I had to exercise caution. Inheritance had created a rift between us, and reason was fading in a sea of emotions. I sat on the couch, trying to gather my thoughts, but the silence in the house had become oppressive. It was then that I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was a thump, as if someone had dropped a heavy object. My instinct told me I should investigate, but a voice in my head warned me that it could be a mistake. Still, curiosity and fear pushed me to get up and head for the kitchen. The door was ajar, and as I peeked in, I saw the light from the refrigerator illuminating the room. Diego was there, standing at the table with a knife in his hand. The image was surreal, like a horror painting. His gaze was lost in nothingness, but as he noticed my presence, the tension in the air became palpable. I didn't know if he was angry or scared, but the knife glinted menacingly in the light. I mentally asked how it had come to this situation. The rain had become a backdrop to our conflict, and the sound of falling water was an echo of what was about to happen. Diego, in his madness, had crossed a line he could not unravel. Greed had taken over, and in that instant, I understood that his desire for the inheritance had eclipsed any brotherly bond we might have had. Without warning, Diego turned to me, the knife still in his hand, and gave me a look I will never forget. It was a mixture of desperation and rage, as if he was fighting his own demons. I realized that I was not only in danger from the knife, but that I was connected to an internal struggle that had been fueled by the death of our parents and the greed that had surrounded them. I tried to reason with him, but the words refused to come out. The atmosphere had become unbreathable, and the silence had become a deafening scream. I knew I had to act before he did. Without thinking, I lunged at him, trying to disarm him. The knife cut the air, and in an instant, it became a melee. Diego's strength was surprising, but adrenaline was driving me. We both fell to the ground, the knife rolling away from us. The rain was still falling, and the sound of the water mingled with our muffled screams. We were in a battle for our lives, and the house became a warfield. As we struggled, the fear turned into a visceral fight. I remembered our childhood, the moments we had shared, the bonds we had built, and realized that all of that was in danger. The storm outside intensified, and the wind howled, as if nature itself was reacting to our struggle. I managed to immobilize Diego, holding his wrist tightly. His breathing was agitated, and in his eyes, I saw a glint of the desperation that had driven him to that extreme. At that moment, I understood that we were not only fighting for our inheritance, but also for our humanity. In the end, I managed to disarm him and let go, feeling the tension between us slowly dissipate. Silence filled the room, and the rain continued to fall. Diego remained on the floor, staring blankly, and I understood that we had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. The storm outside had been a reflection of the storm that had raged between us. The night passed in tense silence, while the rain continued its endless fall. We both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. We had fought for the inheritance, but what we had really put at stake was our relationship, and in that fight, we had lost more than we could have gained. The house, which had been a refuge, had become a reminder of our fragility, and as the storm continued to rage, I knew the real battle was just beginning. I decided that, as an older brother, I had a responsibility to seek psychological help for Diego. Something dark had plagued his mind, leading him to act in a way he could never have imagined. After the fight, his look had changed. It was no longer just the anger and despair I had seen in him. There was a deep sadness, an inner struggle that I could not fully understand. He needed support, and he couldn't let the trauma of our parents' death consume him completely. I contacted a therapist who specialized in trauma and family issues. The sessions began in a safe environment, away from the house that had seen us face our demons. Diego was reluctant at first, but as he talked with the professional, he began to open up. His fears, pain, and sense of loss were laid bare in each session. He began to understand that the inheritance was not just a material matter, but an emotional legacy that we had to face together. While he worked on his healing, I made the decision to move to a safer place, a place Diego has yet to know. The family home, laden with memories and the tragedy that had taken place, was no longer a home for me. I needed a fresh start, a space where I could rebuild my life and protect my brother from his own darkness. The move was difficult, but I knew it was best for both of us. Our parents' sacrifice became a catalyst for our change. They taught us the value of family and love, and although their death had left us wounded, it had also opened the door to the possibility of redemption. Through therapy, Diego began to understand that his pain did not define him, that he could learn to cope. As he healed, our relationship also began to rebuild. The bond we had lost in the storm of greed and fear was beginning to be reborn. Over time, Diego became stronger, more self-aware. There were difficult days, of course, but with each step forward, he felt that our parents were with us, guiding us on the road to reconciliation. The storm that had shattered our lives became a shower of renewal, and though the scars of what had happened would always be present, we knew we had gained something priceless, the chance to be brothers again. My name is Oscar. I am 53 years old and I drive heavy trucks. It was 11 o'clock at night and I was driving down a deserted road, a road I knew well but which, on nights like this, felt like a dead-end maze. The cargo in my truck was valuable, a shipment of appliances to be delivered to a store in town. I thought it would be an easy route, but the storm had turned the road into a dark river, and my mind was restless. As I drove on, I sensed that something was not right. Visibility was poor, and the lights from my truck could barely penetrate the rain curtain. That's when I saw a light behind me. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, but as the light got closer, I realized that the truck following me was very close, almost too close. I pressed on the accelerator, trying to put distance between us, but the van stayed beside me, like a predator stalking its prey. The rain increased in intensity, and the wind howled like a whale. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the silhouette of the van, its headlights illuminating the darkness with an eerie light. I couldn't let them catch me. My mind filled with dark thoughts. I knew that, on the road, desperation could lead people to commit terrible acts. The thought of someone wanting to rob me made me speed up even more, but the van was still there, relentless. Minutes passed, and the feeling of being chased became an unbearable pressure. The road became a tunnel of shadows, and the sound of the rain was an echo of my growing anxiety. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It had already been more than 30 minutes since the van appeared in my mirror. Every time I turned left or right, the light was still there, like a specter, and my heart pounded harder. The storm seemed like an ally of my pursuers, hiding their intentions in the darkness. Once again, I looked back. The van had changed lanes, moving even closer, and in an instant, I felt a shiver run through me. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I looked for a place to stop, a rest area or a gas station, but the road was deserted, as if the world had disappeared. The rain kept falling, and the road became a slippery mirror. Every curve was a challenge, and every sound a reminder that I was being watched. After an hour of pursuit, the van came even closer. I could see the figure of a man behind the wheel, his face illuminated by the glare of the headlights. In his gaze was a determination that made me feel vulnerable. I drove at full speed toward a back road, a detour that would take me on a less traveled route. My hope was to lose them in the darkness. The road was narrow and bumpy, but I felt safer as I drove away from the main road. The van didn't stop, however. Its light was still shining behind me, and my heart sank as I realized it stayed in my wake. The rain was now a torrent, and the sound of falling water was almost deafening. Every turn and every break became a fight for my life. Suddenly, I saw a clearing in the trees, a small space where I could stop and hide. I decided to risk everything. I sped toward the clearing, stopping the truck in a dark corner. I turned off the lights and stood silently, holding my breath, waiting for the truck to pass me by. The rain was still falling, and the sound of the drops was a constant reminder of the tension that filled the air. I waited. Seconds passed, and then minutes. The van stopped on the main road, like a predator sniffing the air. My heart pounded in my ears and adrenaline coursed through my body. The silence was oppressive. I couldn't believe I had managed to elude my pursuers, at least for the moment. Next, my hopes quickly faded. The van began to back up, and its light illuminated the clearing. I was trapped, and anguish gripped me. Before I could react, the van stopped a few feet away from me, and I saw two figures step out of it. They were men, tall and menacing, with faces covered by hoods. I felt my heart stop. I had no other choice. I stepped out of the truck, raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. The men were advancing toward me, and their look was one of pure determination. I knew they were not here to talk. The storm had become the backdrop for an encounter that could change my life forever. As they approached, one of them darted toward the truck, opening the door with unsettling ease. The other stood in front of me, his gaze fixed on my eyes. The rain was coming down hard, and the air was permeated with palpable tension. I knew I could not escape, and despair gripped me. In a matter of seconds, my life became a game of survival. The man who had boarded the truck began to remove the appliances, throwing them on the ground. I felt time stand still as I watched my work, my effort, crumble before my eyes. The sound of objects breaking mingled with the rumble of thunder. Every time an object fell, a piece of my spirit broke with it. The man in front of me pushed me aside, and my body crashed into the mud. The rain soaked my skin, and the cold came over me. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. As I watched my attackers carry away my cargo, I realized that this was not just a robbery. It was a brutal reminder of how vulnerable I was. Life can change in an instant, and on this stormy night, I was a spectator to my own misfortune. When they finished looting the truck, they got into the van and drove off, leaving only the echo of their laughter. I stood in the clearing, feeling hopelessness wash over me. The storm continued its fury, but inside, an eerie calm was taking hold of me. I had lost so much that night, but I knew I could not let the darkness consume me. I stood up slowly, feeling the slippery mud under my feet. But in the midst of the desolation, a spark of determination began to ignite within me. I knew I had to rebuild what I had lost, and though the rain continued its torrent, I understood that the real struggle was just beginning. The night would be long, but I would not give up. There was more at stake than just a stolen cargo. There was a future I had to regain. My name is Samuel. I am 44 years old and I am a doctor. It had been almost a year since I had been assigned to a remote location for my internship as a doctor. That town, known for its isolation and the dangerousness of its inhabitants, had become a nightmare scenario. The rain was falling with such force that it seemed to want to wash away the earth itself, and the sound of the water hitting the roofs echoed like a wail. That night, while I was trying to rest in the small room I had been assigned at the health center, I received a call. The nurse's voice, shaky and hurried, informed me that I had to go to a house on the outskirts of town. There was an injured man, and his condition was critical. However, the warning that the injured man was a local acquaintance and that his affairs were obscure filled me with trepidation. Despite my fear, duty compelled me to get dressed and go out, feeling that I had no choice. As I reached the house, the wind howled. The building stood like something gloomy in the middle of the storm, with dark windows that seemed to be watching me. The door opened slowly, revealing two men who looked at me with distrust. Their faces were marked by violence, and the glint in their eyes told me that I was not in a safe place. But the urgency of the situation compelled me to enter. The wounded man was on the ground, surrounded by a pool of blood. The wound, in his abdomen, was serious. As I approached, my mind struggled between medical ethics and survival instinct. I knew I had to act quickly, but the atmosphere in the room was oppressive. The men who had greeted me were watching me intently, their gazes full of menace. I began to work, trying to concentrate on the procedure as I felt the pressure of his eyes on me. Every movement I made was accompanied by his heavy breathing and barely audible murmurs. The wounded man's pain was evident, and I knew that if I did not attend to him quickly, he might die. However, the tension in the room was palpable. Those men were not there just as observers. They expected something in return. The atmosphere became thicker, as if the rain itself had stopped in time. As I sutured the wound, the injured man looked at me with eyes full of despair. His life depended on my hands, and that reality terrified me. As I moved forward, one of the men approached, his low, menacing voice making me tremble. The implication that my life was also at stake was clear. After what seemed like hours, I finally managed to stabilize the injured man. The tension in the air did not disappear, but at least I had done my duty. However, the relief was short-lived. The men began to murmur among themselves, and their conversation became more intense. The feeling that there was more at stake than just the life of the man in the bed filled me with unease. I knew I had crossed a line, and the recognition that I had been in a dangerous situation came over me. Once I finished, I washed my hands and turned to leave. But the men wouldn't let me leave. One of them stood in my way, his gaze fixed and defiant. At that moment, I understood that it had been a mistake to enter that house. The sense of danger intensified, and the air became heavy, as if the storm itself was about to rage not only over the town, but also over me. I was pushed into the main room, a cluttered space with old furniture and empty bottles. The atmosphere was oppressive, and fear gripped my mind. I knew I was in a trap, and that the life of the man I had saved was not the only one in danger. The rain was still lashing the roof, and the sound became a backdrop to the nightmare that was unfolding. I faced the men, understanding that my only way out was to try to reason with them. I could tell the look in their eyes was not one of negotiation. It was one of possession. One of them approached, and the distance between us became untenable. The situation became chaotic as the wounded man began to stir, moaning in pain. His screams echoed in the room, and the men turned toward him, their faces distorted in anger. In an instant, the atmosphere changed from threat to violence. I realized that my role as a doctor had disappeared, and now I was just a witness in the midst of a storm of madness. Taking advantage of the confusion, I decided it was time to act. With a swift movement, I lunged for the door, but one of the men grabbed me by the arm, dragging me back. The fight intensified, and amidst the commotion, the sound of rain became a deafening scream. At that moment, I understood that I could not get out of there without risking my life. The situation was desperate, and the feeling of being a prisoner in a foreign place intensified. The rain continued to fall, and each drop felt like a reminder that time was running out. The wounded man's life was not the only one at stake. Now, my own existence hung in the balance. The fight continued, and in the midst of the chaos, I managed to break free from the man's grip. I ran towards the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain greeted me with an icy embrace, and the fresh air filled me with energy. However, I knew I was not safe. The storm was not only a natural phenomenon, it was a symbol of the violence I had experienced in that house. I ran toward the road, my footsteps slipping. The rain pounded my face, and the wind howled like a warning. I knew I had to get to town, get help, and get out of that hell. Every step I took me further away from the nightmare I had left behind. As I reached the road, I saw the lights of a vehicle approaching. My heart filled with hope. I waved my arms, shouting to get the driver's attention. The lights stopped, and the vehicle slowly approached. It was a truck driver who stopped when he saw my condition. Without hesitation, I climbed into the truck, feeling that the storm had begun to clear. As the driver asked me what had happened, I looked back at the house I had left behind. What I had experienced that night had changed me forever. The experience had been a brutal reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. As the truck rolled into town, I realized that although I had escaped the storm, the scars of that night would always be with me. I had faced the horror and made it out alive. In the early morning hours, as the storm finally began to subside, the sky lit up with a faint glow. The rain had left a blanket of water on the ground, and the fresh air filled me with a sense of relief. As the truck driver dropped me off at the entrance to the village, his face reflected concern and curiosity. But I had no time for explanations. The previous night's experience was still weighing on my mind, and I knew I had to leave that place. I walked through the deserted streets, feeling the weight of my decision with every step. The house where I had faced terror and madness was receding in my mind, but images of violence and despair clung to my memory. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk facing those men again, or remembering the fragility of life in that remote village. So, without looking back, I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the exit of the village. As I left, the horizon was brightening with a new dawn, promising a different future. With each step, I was leaving behind not only a place, but also a part of me that had been caught in the previous night's storm. The road stretched out before me, and though the path was uncertain, I knew I would never return to that town again. I had made the decision to seek a new beginning, away from the darkness I had experienced. With the sun peeking timidly over the horizon, I walked away from that place, feeling that each step freed me from the chains of the past. I would never return to that town again, and with that certainty, a new hope began to blossom within me. My name is Lucas. I am 25 years old and I am a nurse. I was sitting in my living room, the lights off and the sound of the water hitting the glass was the only thing that broke the silence. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm that had erupted in my life. Since I had ended my relationship with Anna, my world had become chaotic, and that night was the culmination of it all. Anna and I had shared intense moments, but there was also a darkness in her that I had never been able to ignore. At first, her passion had been attractive, but over time, her behavior became possessive and controlling. After weeks of arguments and conflict, I decided enough was enough. I broke up with her, hoping that decision would give me peace, but I was sorely mistaken. The first few days after the breakup were difficult, but I believed I could move on. Anna, however, did not accept it. At first it was insistent messages, then calls, and finally unexpected visits. Her presence, which had once thrilled me, now became a shadow that followed me wherever I went. That night, as the rain lashed the windows, I felt a chill run through me. I had noticed something strange in the previous days. Lights flickering through the window, a car passing by my street more often than usual. Anna was there, lurking, like a lingering shadow. Discomfort turned to fear, and fear to paranoia. I couldn't help but remember her face, the mixture of sadness and anger in her eyes when I told her I could no longer be with her. I knew she hadn't taken it well, but I couldn't have imagined how far she would go. I decided it was time to go outside, to get some fresh air and clear my mind. I grabbed my coat and headed outside, feeling the cold water hit me instantly. As I walked, I felt someone following me, an oppressive feeling that I couldn't shake. As I turned a corner, I saw a figure in the distance. It was Anna. Her figure was silhouetted against the dark background, soaking wet, her hair sticking to her face. I couldn't believe she was there, in the rain, waiting for me. Her gaze was fixed, intense, as if she was able to pierce the storm and reach me. I decided to turn around and go home, but she started to follow me. The sound of her footsteps mingled with the rain, and every time I turned around, I saw her closer. Her presence became suffocating, and fear began to take hold of me. I quickened my pace, feeling the panic begin to grow in my chest. Arriving home, I slammed the door shut, leaning my back against it as if that could protect me. The rain was still falling, and the sound became a deafening echo in my mind. I felt that Anna was right there, outside, waiting. The darkness of the night became even more intense, and the shadow of her figure became more present in my thoughts. Minutes passed, and fear began to turn into despair. I couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by anxiety. So I decided I had to call someone, get help, someone who could guide me through this madness. When I picked up the phone, I noticed that the signal was failing, as if I was trapped in a world I couldn't escape. A new wave of panic swept over me. With no signal, no help, and Anna lurking, the situation was becoming more and more desperate. My mind began to wander, imagining the worst. What would I do if she came in? What did she want from me? I decided I had to do something. I plucked up my courage and went to the window, peering out cautiously. The rain was coming down hard, but I couldn't see the road. As I looked out onto the street, I saw her standing still, like a specter in the middle of the storm. My heart skipped a beat. What did she want? The answer was clear. Without thinking, I decided to go out again. The rain enveloped me, and the cold air hit me like a wave. I started walking, trying to keep moving, hoping that the storm would give me the freedom I so desired. However, the rain was not only falling on me, it was also falling on my mind, clouding my thoughts and filling them with fear. As I walked away, I felt someone following me again. I looked back, and there she was, closer than before. Her gaze was intense, almost hypnotic, and I felt despair wash over me again. I quickened my pace, trying to lose her in the rain, but she seemed always one step ahead. The feeling of being a mouse trapped in a dark labyrinth grew stronger and stronger. In a moment of desperation, I decided to head for a bar that I knew was open, a refuge in the midst of this madness. Maybe there I could find some safety, even if it was only temporary. I ran to the bar, my feet slipping, and when I got there, I pushed the door hard. For a moment, I thought I had left this woman behind, but as I settled into a corner, I felt fear still lurking in the back of my mind. As I tried to calm down, I looked out the window. Anna's figure was present again, waiting, like a patient predator. The bar was full of people, but in that instant, I felt completely alone. The shadow of her presence loomed over me, and I knew I could not escape it. A few minutes later, the door burst open and Anna appeared in the doorway, her hair sodden and her gaze determined. The murmur of conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to her. The atmosphere became thick, and the fear turned to icy silence. Anna advanced toward me, and the bar felt like a stage in a horror play that I couldn't leave. It was a reminder that I was trapped in her game. I couldn't let her get close, so I stood up and backed away, feeling the panic start to take hold of me again. The bartender, noticing the tension, approached, but Anna ignored him. Her gaze was fixed on me, and in her expression I saw a flash of madness. I couldn't stand there. I couldn't let the storm rage again. So I decided to leave, pushing Anna out of my way as I headed for the door. The rain greeted me like an icy embrace, and I ran again, feeling that the storm had taken on a life of its own. Anna was behind me, her breathing heavy, and her presence inescapable. As I left the bar, instead of returning home, a sudden thought filled me with determination. The pressure of the storm was still pounding in my chest, but I knew I couldn't let that woman continue to control my life. The police station was not far away, and with each step, I felt more relieved. I went inside and went to the counter, where an officer looked at me with concern. Without hesitation, I told them everything. About Anna, her harassment, the fear I had been feeling. The officers listened attentively, and their professionalism offered me a glimmer of hope. After taking my statement, they began to investigate my situation. They filed a harassment charge against him and informed me that they could help me sign a restraining order. Relief washed over me that there was a way to end this nightmare. As I signed the papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. With the restraining order in hand, I felt stronger, freer. The shadow had begun to fade. But I knew I couldn't stay in the same place or in the same routine that had led me into this storm. I decided it was time for a radical change in my life. Soon after, I packed up my things and moved to a new city, looking for a job where I could start over. Although the road ahead was uncertain, for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Anna was no longer a part of my life. With each passing day, I began to forget the anguish I had felt. The shadow of that woman was slowly fading, and with it, the storm that had tormented my life. As I looked to the future, I knew I had made the right decision, to leave the past behind and build a new beginning. The relationship had been a mixture of love and madness, and that night, in the midst of the storm, I knew that the only way to free myself was to confront it. The fight I had been avoiding had arrived, and as the water fell, I understood that I had to find the strength to face the inevitable. My name is Joshua. I am 31 years old. He worked as a security officer in an old assembly plant on the outskirts of the city. The building was huge, a half-reconstructed abandoned structure with rusted areas and eternally dark corridors. From the first day, I felt something strange about the place, a kind of weight in the air that, with each night, seemed to grow denser. Despite the bad feelings, the job paid well, and in my situation, I couldn't turn it down. That night, it was pouring rain, the kind of storm that rattles the windows and covers any sound. I was walking down the main hallway, where the lights were flickering from the short circuits they hadn't finished repairing. My flashlight was the only thing I could rely on, the only steady source of light in a sea of eerie shadows. As I went along, I remembered the story of a worker who had disappeared months ago in that same factory, a case that the police had closed without much investigation. Rumor had it that it had been something shady, that they had found traces of blood on the emergency stairs, although no one dared to confirm or deny anything. I decided to put that thought out of my mind. The last thing I needed was to give free rein to my imagination. My tour was to cover from the first floor to the top floor, a 5-story building where machines were piled up like rusty skeletons. Lightning illuminated the windows, and, in that flash of light, I could see the shadow of the old presses and industrials that slept eternally. There was no sign of life. Until, on the 3rd floor, something changed. I smelled a strange odor in the air, like iron or something metallic that shouldn't be there. The flashlight pointed down the hall, and then I saw it. A shadow. I froze, frozen, as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The figure was motionless, standing just a few feet away. It wasn't moving, just watching. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was just an illusion, that my eyes were playing tricks with the shadows. But in the silence of the factory, I could hear something, a kind of dripping. I looked down at the floor and noticed small, dark spots extending in a trail coming from that figure. The sound of the rain outside was deafening, but the dripping was even more persistent, as if it were trying to speak to me in its own language. I decided to approach, moved by a mixture of fear and curiosity. As I took a few steps, I noticed that the puddle was bigger than I imagined, and that the color was not water, but blood. Panic began to settle in my mind. The figure was still standing, not moving, not making a sound. The storm roared outside, and when a flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, I saw the face of the figure. It was a man with his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness, his face bloodied and his lips parted. He was not breathing. His body was hanging from a hook that someone had attached to the ceiling. The horror hit me full on, and I had to put a hand to my mouth to keep from screaming. What was that body doing here? Who had put it there? I looked around, searching for some clue, some sign of movement that might tell me if the killer was still around. But everything was silent, as if the building itself was conspiring to hide its prey. I tried to back up, but panic made me stagger. My footsteps felt clumsy and noisy in the silence. Every sound felt like a rumble. I couldn't run. If the killer was here, the last thing I wanted was to alert him to my presence. I took a breath of air, tried to remain calm, and retraced my steps toward the stairs. The plan was simple. Go down to the first floor, get the keys to my truck, and leave immediately. But as I went on, I felt the hallway getting longer and longer, as if the building wanted to hold me back. Every shadow seemed to whisper my name, and the echo of my footsteps sounded as if someone else was following me. I reached the stairs. As I looked down, my heart skipped a beat. Halfway down, I could make out another figure, this time standing, as if waiting for me. I froze. It was not a suspended body or a figure in the gloom. It was someone in flesh and blood, watching me with a calmness that disarmed me. Adrenaline hit me hard. I knew this person was not there to help me. I couldn't move, and time seemed to stand still as our gazes met in the gloom. His face was covered by a makeshift mask, and he was holding something in his hand, something sharp that glinted in the dim light. At that moment, I understood that the place was riddled with traps. That abandoned factory was not just a workplace, but the scene of something much darker. The disappearance of the worker, the rumors of blood on the stairs, the body hanging on the third floor, all were clues that led to this moment. I thought about running, but every fiber of my being told me I wouldn't make it. The masked man took a step toward me, slow and calculated, like a predator who enjoys prolonging the agony of his prey. My breathing became erratic, and I could barely think clearly. My options were slim, but I couldn't let myself be trapped so easily. I retreated to the third floor, knowing that it would be like walking into an even bigger trap, but there was no other option. I returned to that same corridor, where the body still hung from the hook. I couldn't take my eyes off it, fearing that at any moment the masked man would appear behind me. The seconds seemed like hours, and the sound of my footsteps was the only witness to my terror. As I reached the end of the corridor, I noticed an emergency door I had not seen before. It was my last chance. Without a second thought, I pushed it open and launched myself down the stairs, ignoring the pain I felt in my legs as I sped down. My only goal was to get out of there. Finally, I reached the first floor and ran towards the exit. The rain hit my face as I made it across the threshold of the factory. I jumped into my truck and drove off without looking back. It didn't matter if anyone was following me or if that factory was still keeping its dark secrets. Since that night, I did not return to the factory. I quit my job and moved away. But even today, on stormy days, I still feel the pressure in the air and the echo of footsteps that never quite left me. My name is Leonardo. I am 46 years old. I had worked at the train station for several years, always on the night shift. My days began when the others ended, and the silence of the early mornings had accustomed me to that stillness, where only the metallic clatter of the tracks and the distant echo of the moving trains could be heard. However, that night was not like the others. Since I arrived, the storm had been lashing the city with unrelenting fury. Lightning illuminated the empty platform at times, showing puddles reflecting a pale, diffuse light. The wind brought gusts of cold water that chilled to the bone. The station felt lonelier than usual, as if the weather had managed to drive out any soul who might have thought of approaching. Still, the rule was clear. I had to remain at my post until the arrival of the last train of the night. Minutes passed and everything was still calm. My eyes roamed the station almost by inertia, stopping at every corner. It was then that I saw her. It was a woman with dark, wet hair, standing at the edge of the platform. She was alone, so still that she almost looked like a statue. She seemed oblivious to the storm, to the sound of the water falling relentlessly and the rumbling of the thunder. Something about his posture made me uneasy. His arms were slumped at his sides, and his gaze seemed lost in the distance. He was not there to catch the train, I knew. There was no ticket in her hands, no luggage, not even the impatience of someone waiting for something. There was a stillness about her that was disconcerting, and a part of me felt the urge to approach, to make sure she wasn't in danger. But another instinct, a deeper one, told me not to. The sound of an approaching train interrupted my thoughts. It was the last one of the day, the one coming from the periphery and passing through this station without stopping. From where I stood, I could see the train's lights approaching through the rain curtain, briefly illuminating the platform with a spectral glow. Suddenly, the woman began to move. She took a few steps forward, as if attracted by the train lights. She didn't need to see any more to understand what was about to happen. I barely had time to react. The woman advanced without hesitation, just as the train was passing. The roar was deafening. The air seemed charged with violent energy, and the sound of her body being dragged under the wheels mingled with the screeching of the brakes. I stood transfixed, unable to look away from the horror unfolding in front of me. When the train finally stopped, silence fell again over the station, though it was a heavy, agonizing silence, full of death. I was in shock, unable to move. I had seen many things at work in that station, but never anything so disturbing. The image of his body disappearing under the wheels would haunt me forever. However, the worst was yet to come. As I approached the edge of the platform to see if there was anything I could do, although I knew it was useless, I noticed a detail that had gone unnoticed until then. In the puddle at my feet, I saw a sheet of paper, soaked and crumpled, that seemed to have fallen out of one of his pockets. I took it, feeling the moisture pierce the paper, and unfolded it with trembling hands. There wasn't much written on it, just a few words, but what I saw made my heart beat even faster. We follow the truth. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what it meant, but an uneasy feeling ran through me. What truth? Who were we? From that moment on, things began to change. Although I tried to forget what had happened, the image of that woman and her mysterious message appeared in my dreams, and little by little, I felt that I was consumed by the need to understand why she had done what she had done. I spent nights reviewing the security camera recordings, analyzing every second, trying to find some clue, some sign that it had all been a nightmare. But there she was, always, with the same lost and desolate expression, waiting. As the days went by, the situation at the station became stranger. It wasn't just my paranoia. Something was going on. Several people began to disappear under suspicious circumstances, always in the vicinity of the station, and their disappearances had a disturbing pattern. They had all been last seen on stormy days, walking in the direction of the tracks. No one knew what attracted them, but it could not be a coincidence. I decided to investigate on my own. I started digging through the records, discreetly asking some of my colleagues. I discovered that the woman, whose name I never managed to find out, had been seen at the station several times before that night. Some said she seemed to be looking for something. Others said she just stood there motionless, as if waiting for someone. One night, while going through old files in the office, I found a pattern that made my blood run cold. There were records of other similar incidents, of people who had thrown themselves in front of trains on stormy days, always without a trace. The station had been the scene of such tragedies for decades, and in every case, notes or messages mentioning the truth or the mission had been found next to the bodies. The rain began to pour, and the pounding against the office windows reminded me of that night. I closed the files, unable to bear any more details. But in my mind, the puzzle took shape. I understood that the station attracted people, that it somehow became a magnet for lost souls looking for answers, answers they never got. The last train of the night passed in front of me and startled me. Looking at the clock, I realized that I had spent hours immersed in that investigation, and I stood up, determined to finish my shift and leave. However, a figure on the platform stopped me. It was another man, standing motionless in the rain. His face was shadowed, and in his hand he held a sheet of paper. An impulse made me run to him, screaming, trying to stop the inevitable. But when I got there, he was gone. In his place, I found another soggy piece of paper. It was a message, written in the same shaky handwriting as the woman's note. The truth sets us free. At that moment, I understood that the station had a power over people, a dark magnetism that drew them to the tracks and to death. That night, I left my post at the station for good. I didn't want to know more. I didn't want to understand. The truth those people were looking for was a mystery I didn't want to solve. But every time it rains, and I hear the echo of a train in the distance, I feel that a part of me is still there, trapped in that station, waiting for answers that will never come.